At 5:30 in the morning on our 7th anniversary, my husband texted me his flight itinerary to the Maldives with his 23-year-old assistant. His message was cold. Do not wait up. Get a lawyer. He thinks he is the untouchable king of a tech empire worth hundreds of millions, but he forgot one tiny detail. I wrote the core algorithm, and I own the patents. When his plane lands, he will be a penniless tourist. Hello. Dear listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no budget to continue our operations. If you enjoy our story today, please kindly consider supporting us with just $1 so our channel can have the budget to pay our personnel, helping them cover their living expenses and continue creating more wonderful stories to serve you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link located in the description or the comments section of this video. My name is Peyton Knight. I am 34 years old, and I am a software architect. It was exactly 5:30 in the morning on the day of our 7th wedding anniversary. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, steady hum of the espresso machine doing its work. I stood in our immaculate, cold marble kitchen, watching the dark liquid pull into a porcelain cup, breathing in the bitter aroma of freshly roasted beans. It was supposed to be a day of celebration. We had dinner reservations at a Michelin-starred restaurant downtown at 8 o'clock tonight. Instead, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. The screen lit up in the dim light, casting a harsh, cold glow over the stone counter. It was a message from Julian, my husband. I swiped the screen open, expecting a generic early morning anniversary wish sent from the back of his luxury town car. What I read instead was a meticulously crafted execution of our entire marriage. The text was brutally efficient, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, closure, or dignity. Peyton, the message read, I am going to the Maldives. The flight leaves in exactly 2 hours. I am not taking you. I am taking Mia. You have become entirely too dry, too obsessed with your code, and I need someone who actually knows how to live with passion. Do not call me. Do not wait up crying. Just find a good lawyer and have your things packed and out of the house by the time I get back. Mia, she was his 23-year-old public relations assistant. She had hair the color of spun sugar, a laugh that sounded like silver bells, and she constantly looked at Julian as if he were a living god who had just descended from the heavens. Most women would have collapsed. Most wives would have dropped their coffee cup, let it shatter into 100 pieces against the imported hardwood floor, and dissolved into violent hysterics. They would have called their mothers, their sisters, their best friends. They would have dialed his number over and over again until the voicemail box was completely full of desperate, weeping pleas. I did none of those things. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness washed over me. It was the exact same icy calm I always felt when I was thousands of lines deep into a complex algorithm and finally spotted the singular fatal error in the system's logic. I reached out, picked up my espresso, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set the cup down with a soft click. A quiet, humorless smirk touched the corners of my mouth. Julian had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his entire existence. Julian was the chief executive officer of Aegis Nova Solutions, a cybersecurity tech firm rising faster than a rocket in Silicon Valley. He was the golden boy of the industry. He was the glossy, charismatic frontman who wore bespoke suits that cost $5,000, charmed nervous investors with his blinding smile, and graced the covers of top business magazines. He possessed the specific kind of arrogance that came naturally to men who believed they had conquered the world all by themselves. But Julian was just the face. He was the shiny exterior of a luxury vehicle. I was the engine. For 7 long years, I had stood willingly in the shadows, perfectly content to let him soak up the flashing cameras and the public adoration. I was the one who spent countless sleepless nights architecting the core algorithm that made Aegis Nova's security software completely impenetrable. I wrote every single line of the foundation that held his entire $100 million empire together. Julian loved the spotlight so much that he eventually began to believe his own press. He genuinely believed he had built this colossal empire all on his own. In his blinding arrogance, and perhaps in the intoxicating haze of his affair with a 23-year-old girl, the great executive had forgotten one tiny, insignificant detail. He did not own the algorithm. I did. 8 months before we walked down the aisle, I had quietly, legally, and permanently patented the core code under a private shell company called Nightforge Limited Liability Company. It was a preemptive measure, a quiet safety net born out of the logical, calculating paranoia that makes me exceptionally good at my profession. Julian never knew about it. Aegis Nova Solutions did not actually own their intellectual property. They were merely leasing the licensing rights from my hidden company. And buried deep within the 200 pages of that corporate licensing agreement, a document Julian had barely skimmed and signed with his expensive fountain pen, because reading the fine print bored him, was a very specific, ironclad morality clause. It explicitly stipulated that any gross personal misconduct, public scandal, or ethical breach by the executive leadership of the licensee would result in the immediate and permanent revocation of the software license. A husband taking his 23-year-old employee on an anniversary trip to an island paradise while simultaneously destroying his marriage via a text message certainly qualified as gross personal misconduct. I looked at his cruel message one last time. I felt absolutely no urge to reply. There would be no weeping, no begging, no angry paragraphs demanding an explanation. Explanations were for fragile people who still cared about repairing things. I only cared about execution. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight down the hall to my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the blinking standby lights of my massive private servers. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, flipped open the cold aluminum lid of my laptop, and watched the brilliant screen blaze to life. My fingers rested lightly on the mechanical keyboard, hovering over the keys like a concert pianist about to begin a devastating symphony. Julian wanted a divorce. He wanted to discard me for a younger, shinier model and keep his golden throne. But in the ruthless world of programming, when a system is irredeemably corrupted, you do not waste time trying to fix it. You wipe the servers clean. I cracked my knuckles, took one deep breath, and began the precise, methodical process of tearing his glorious empire down to the dirt. As my fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, executing the initial secure access protocols, my mind involuntarily drifted back through the dark corridors of the past 2 years. When our company began generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue, something fundamentally fractured within the dynamic of our relationship. The shift was not a sudden explosion. Rather, it was a slow, creeping rot that I chose not to see. I vividly remember the Julian I had married. He was a man who would gladly stay up with me until 3 a.m, eating cold delivery pizza on the floor of our tiny apartment, passionately debating the complex architecture of a neural network. But as the corporate bank accounts swelled to absurd proportions, that earnest young man vanished completely. He was systematically replaced by a stranger entirely obsessed with his own reflection. The exhausting but thrilling late-night coding sessions were replaced by lavish, exclusive rooftop parties. He traded his comfortable university hoodies for custom-tailored Italian suits that cost more than my first automobile. He stopped asking me about the intricate software updates and started consulting professional stylists about his public aesthetic. In computer science, engineers are strictly trained to look for anomalies, those tiny, seemingly insignificant discrepancies in the data that indicate a critical system failure is imminent. My marriage had been flashing bright red warning signs for 24 solid months, and I had deliberately turned a blind eye to every single one of them. The most glaring anomaly was the sudden desynchronization of his daily schedule. There were sudden, supposedly urgent business trips to Miami or New York. He would hastily pack a leather duffel bag on a Thursday evening and return exhausted late Sunday night. "It is a vital networking event, Peyton," he would say, meticulously adjusting his expensive silk tie in the hallway mirror. "We have to keep the major investors happy and confident." The markets are closed on weekends, Julian, I would point out quietly. He would just offer a dismissive wave of his hand. Relationships are built over weekend golf games, not boardroom tables. You of all people should know I am doing this for us. I knew the investors he was supposed to be meeting did not operate in those cities. I knew the flight logs on our shared account did not match his supposed itineraries. I saw the variables misaligning right in front of my eyes, but I steadfastly refused to compile the data into the obvious conclusion. Then came the undeniable incident with the receipt. Exactly 6 months ago. I was searching for a specific vendor contract on his unlocked home computer and accidentally clicked open his corporate email inbox. Staring back at me in harsh white pixels was an electronic invoice from an ultra-exclusive jeweler in Manhattan. It was a receipt for a delicate diamond tennis bracelet, totaling exactly $35,000. My heart seized violently in my chest. I sat there in his luxurious home office for nearly 2 hours, staring at the bright screen, feeling a cold, suffocating knot form deep in my stomach. However, the human mind is a terrifyingly efficient machine when it comes to emotional self-preservation. Instead of confronting the man I slept next to, I wrote a psychological patch to cover the glitch. I desperately convinced myself it was a lavish corporate gift for the demanding wife of our lead venture capitalist. I forced my brain to believe the pathetic lie because accepting the alternative would require me to systematically dismantle my entire life. And then, there was Mia. She was hired just over a year ago. I observed her from a distance at our opulent corporate galas, standing quietly at the edge of his widening circle of admirers. It was not just her youth or her carefully curated appearance that deeply unsettled me. It was the specific way she looked at him. She looked at Julian with absolute, unadulterated worship, gazing up as if he were a mythical titan who had conquered the digital world with his bare hands. I could never, ever look at him that way. I knew the painfully ordinary man standing behind the heavy velvet curtain. I knew he was terribly afraid of public speaking before he hired an expensive vocal coach. I knew he could not write a single line of functional back-end code to save his own life. I knew every hidden vulnerability, every petty insecurity, and every character flaw. Mia only saw the brilliant billionaire visionary, and Julian was deeply, hopelessly addicted to that flawless reflection of himself. As I typed another line of terminal command, watching the green text cascade down my black screen, I had to finally confess my own profound cowardice. For a woman who prided herself on flawless logic and absolute truth, I had willingly lived in a pathetic state of emotional denial. I had cowardly chosen the comfortable, predictable silence of a hollow marriage over the agonizing, messy noise of a public betrayal. I wanted to protect the perfect facade we presented to the world, the illusion of the ultimate technological power couple. I foolishly thought if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept my head down and focused strictly on the architecture of our products, the bugs in our relationship would somehow miraculously resolve themselves over time. But ignoring a fatal error does not fix the system. It merely guarantees a much more catastrophic crash. The illusion I had fought so desperately to protect was nothing but a fragile shell of a life. I had built a massive emotional firewall to keep the agonizing truth out, but his cowardly morning text message had shattered it beyond any hope of repair. He did not just betray me. He humiliated me. That painful realization burned away the very last remnants of my denial, leaving behind nothing but a chilling, hyper-focused clarity. I was completely done being the silent architect of his stolen greatness. The time for denial was officially over. The digital clock on my secondary monitor clicked to exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. I picked up my phone and dialed a secured number. It rang precisely twice before a sharp, gravelly voice answered. "Peyton," Victor Vance said, sounding as awake and alert as if it were mid-afternoon. Victor was a ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney who operated out of an intimidating high-rise in Chicago. More importantly, he was the only living soul on this planet who truly understood the convoluted, airtight legal architecture of Nightforge Limited Liability Company. "Victor," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "It is time. Trigger the morality clause in the Aegis Nova licensing agreement. I want the software license revoked permanently, effective immediately. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of his heavy gold pen. "Are you absolutely certain?" Victor asked, his tone shifting instantly into predatory mode. "Once I file this motion, there is absolutely no stepping back. It is the corporate equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike." Julian is currently on a flight to the Maldives with his 23-year-old public relations assistant, I replied evenly. "Execute the strike, Victor." "Consider it done," Victor said, a hint of dark, genuine satisfaction creeping into his voice. "I will have the cease and desist orders drafted and legally served to their board of directors before their morning coffee gets cold." "Good, but we are not stopping there," I continued, opening a new encrypted browser tab on my workstation. "Get me the personal cell phone number for the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Corps." For the first time in our entire professional relationship, I actually heard Victor gasp. Vanguard Corps was Julian's fiercest, most bitter rival in the global cybersecurity market. For 3 agonizing years, Vanguard had desperately tried to reverse engineer my algorithm, throwing tens of millions of dollars into aggressive research and development, only to fail miserably every single time. They lusted after my technology with a desperate, ravenous hunger. "Peyton," Victor murmured, sheer awe lacing his words, "that is not just burning the bridge, that is salting the earth." "Just get me the number, Victor." 5 minutes later, I was connected directly to the private line of Vanguard Corps' chief executive. I did not bother with polite pleasantries. I introduced myself not as Julian's silent wife, but as the sole proprietary owner of the advanced algorithm that was currently choking his entire company out of the market. I offered him a complete, exclusive buyout of the intellectual property. The price was set at exactly $75 million. I demanded the payment entirely in liquid cash transfers, and I explicitly required all legal paperwork to be finalized, signed, and locked within exactly 24 hours. He tried to stall and negotiate, attempting to buy time to consult his board of directors. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to say yes, or I would hang up and call the next competitor on my list. He agreed at the 45-second mark. With the legal trap completely set and the massive sale in motion, I turned my attention back to the glowing terminal on my desk. It was time for the extraction. I logged into the Aegis Nova mainframes using my ultimate superuser administrative credentials. I watched the sprawling, complex network of the company I had built from the ground up map itself across my multiple screens. The heartbeat of the servers pulsed in rhythmic flashes of blue and green data streams. I was not launching a cyber attack. I was not deploying a malicious virus or a destructive digital worm. I was simply a legal owner walking into a leased property and repossessing my own furniture. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, typing out a series of brutal, highly complex extraction commands. I targeted the absolute core repositories, line by line, directory by directory. I systematically decoupled the neural network from their operational servers. I watched the progress bars fill up rapidly as petabytes of proprietary data were legally yanked out of Aegis Nova's active environment and transferred directly into my heavily encrypted offshore servers. I stripped away their security protocols, their threat detection matrices, and their real-time analysis engines. I left the user interfaces perfectly intact, so the main dashboard would look completely normal to any casual observer. But behind those pretty graphics, there was absolutely nothing left. It was a perfectly hollowed-out digital shell. I had surgically removed the spine of a $100 million tech giant without triggering a single internal alarm. When the final command executed and the terminal confirmed a successful total extraction, I hit the Enter key one last time to permanently lock out all internal access protocols. No senior engineer at Aegis Nova would be able to restart the core system because the core system no longer existed on their hardware. I stood up from my desk. The digital clock now read 8:45 in the morning. My work here was entirely finished. I walked into the massive, echoing master bedroom. The walk-in closet was larger than most city studio apartments, Filled entirely with designer clothes Julian had bought me to ensure I looked the part of a polished billionaire's wife at his endless galas. I ignored all of it. I pulled down exactly 2 plain, sturdy suitcases from the top shelf. I packed only my essential comfortable clothing, my vital personal documents, and my private hard drives. I left the sparkling diamond necklaces, the expensive imported perfumes, and the custom silk gowns hanging perfectly in their designated places. I wanted absolutely nothing that his contaminated corporate money had purchased. I rolled the 2 suitcases down the grand, sweeping staircase of our sprawling mansion. The bright morning sun was pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine, silent perfection of the massive house. I stopped at the heavy oak dining table in the center of the grand foyer. From my leather bag, I pulled out a fresh, crisp copy of the intellectual property sale agreement with Vanguard Corp, bearing Victor's expedited digital notary seal. I laid the thick stack of papers right in the center of the dark wood table. Then, I slid the heavy platinum wedding ring off my left hand. The metal felt remarkably cold against my skin. I placed the ring deliberately on top of the contract, right over the blank line where Julian's signature should have been. I turned around, grabbed the heavy handles of my 2 suitcases, and walked out the front door, locking it firmly behind me. Somewhere 30,000 feet above the shimmering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, Julian was undoubtedly reclining in the plush leather seat of a first-class luxury cabin. He was likely clinking crystal flutes of outrageously expensive champagne with Mia. Completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality unfolding below him, he was probably whispering grand, arrogant promises about their sunny future together, genuinely believing he was flying toward a tropical paradise as an invincible billionaire king. He had absolutely no idea that his magnificent digital kingdom was currently burning down to the foundational studs. Back in Silicon Valley, exactly 2 hours after I had quietly rolled my luggage out of our quiet mansion, the gleaming, ultra-modern headquarters of Aegis Nova Solutions descended into a state of pure, unadulterated pandemonium. The massive digital monitoring dashboards in the Central Network Operations Center, which normally pulsed with a steady, reassuring flow of green data streams, suddenly flashed a blinding, synchronized crimson red. A catastrophic system failure warning blared through the pristine hallways. David, the incredibly highly paid chief technology officer, who usually strutted through the office with supreme, unearned arrogance, was practically hyperventilating. He sprinted into the server room, his expensive silk tie flapping wildly behind him. He and his team of elite software engineers frantically hammered at their mechanical keyboards, desperately trying to run emergency diagnostic protocols and reboot the mainframes, but there was absolutely nothing left for them to reboot. The entire logical foundation of their heavily marketed, supposedly impenetrable security network had simply evaporated into the digital ether. When David frantically attempted to access the encrypted backup repositories to restore the missing environment, his screen violently rejected him. He hit a solid, unyielding digital wall. His supreme administrative privileges had been completely revoked. He stared at the error message in sheer, cold terror. The code was not corrupted by a foreign virus. It had not been hacked by a rogue syndicate. It was just legally and totally gone. The suffocating panic quickly traveled up the private glass elevator shafts directly into the executive boardroom. The chief operating officer and the entire board of directors were sweating profusely right through their tailored designer suits. They had dozens of furious tech billionaires, massive financial institutions, and international defense contractors waiting impatiently on hold, screaming through the speakerphones, demanding to know exactly why their multi-million-dollar network security had abruptly gone completely dark. The board members desperately dialed Julian's private cellular number over and over again. Their faces grew increasingly pale with mounting terror as every single frantic call went straight to an automated voicemail service. Julian's phone was securely locked in airplane mode, silencing the desperate cries of his dying empire while he nibbled on complimentary caviar. The absolute fatal blow arrived in the lobby precisely at the stroke of noon. A small, sharply dressed army of heavily compensated corporate attorneys representing Vanguard Corps, marched directly through the sliding glass doors of Aegis Nova. They did not come to schedule a friendly meeting. They officially served the terrified board of directors with a massive, heavy stack of legal injunctions. The impeccably dressed lead attorney stood in the center of the boardroom and bluntly informed them that Vanguard Corps was now the sole, legally registered proprietor of the core algorithm. He slapped a thick cease and desist order onto the mahogany table. The document mandated an immediate total halt of all commercial operations. Aegis Nova was strictly forbidden from selling, operating, or even attempting to digitally restore the software they had built their entire reputation upon. The catastrophic news leaked to the private financial sectors faster than a raging wildfire. Internal company valuation plummeted straight off a cliff in a matter of mere minutes. Major venture capitalists, the very men and women who had poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Julian's charismatic promises and flashy presentations, began violently pulling their funding. The corporate email servers were instantly flooded with aggressive legal threats from their biggest lead investors. They promised to relentlessly sue Julian personally for massive corporate fraud, gross negligence, and breach of fiduciary duty. His glorious, shiny empire had spectacularly collapsed into a pile of worthless rubble before the lunch hour was even over. I watched absolutely none of this chaotic destruction in person. By 11 o'clock that night, I was sitting comfortably in an incredibly spacious, dimly lit first-class suite on a massive commercial aircraft heading straight across the world toward the Amalfi Coast in Italy. The cabin was incredibly quiet, filled only with the soothing, low hum of the jet engines. I casually opened the heavily encrypted banking application on my secured tablet. A single, silent green notification popped up on the bright screen. It officially confirmed that a massive wire transfer of exactly $75 million from Vanguard Corps had successfully cleared all international banking protocols. The incredible sum of money was now sitting safely and securely in my private, untraceable offshore account. I closed the banking application and locked the tablet screen. A polite, softly spoken flight attendant walked by and gently placed a heavy crystal glass of vintage red wine on my polished side table. I picked up the elegant glass, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, and felt the rich, complex flavors coat my tongue. Then, I reached for my personal cellular phone, held down the power button, and powered it off completely. The glowing screen went totally black. For the first time in 7 long years, I was completely untethered, incredibly wealthy, and totally free. The heavy tropical heat of the Indian Ocean hit Julian the moment he stepped off the private water taxi and onto the pristine wooden dock of the exclusive Maldives resort. He walked with the swagger of a conquering emperor, his arm draped casually over Mia's shoulders. She was wearing expensive designer sunglasses and a flowing silk dress, practically vibrating with sheer excitement at the sight of the breathtaking overwater villas. They were ushered directly into the breezy, open-air reception pavilion, handed cool, scented towels, and offered tall glasses of freshly pressed exotic fruit juice. Julian approached the polished mahogany front desk with a practiced, arrogant smirk. The impeccably dressed resort manager smiled warmly, welcoming the famous technology executive by name, and politely requested a credit card to authorize the mandatory security deposit for their ultra-luxury presidential suite. The deposit alone was $25,000. Julian casually flipped open his imported leather wallet, pulled out his heavy, solid metal corporate black card, and slid it across the smooth wooden counter with a condescending flick of his wrist. The manager inserted the heavy metal card into the payment terminal. A few agonizing seconds passed. The machine emitted a sharp, unpleasant beep. The manager frowned slightly, apologizing profusely for the terrible inconvenience, and tried the card a second time. The machine beeped again. A bright red text illuminated the small digital screen. Transaction declined. Julian scoffed loudly, arrogantly blaming the isolated island's poor internet connection. He impatiently snatched the black card back and tossed down his secondary platinum corporate card. The manager ran it, declined. Julian's arrogant smile began to falter. replaced quickly by a flash of genuine irritation. He pulled out a third card, a high-limit travel card reserved strictly for international corporate emergencies. It was immediately and violently rejected. Every single financial artery tied to Aegis Nova Solutions had been completely frozen by federal investigators and panicked bank executives hours ago, muttering furious insults about incompetent banking systems under his breath. Julian finally reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He disabled the airplane mode, fully intending to call his personal wealth manager and scream until the accounts were instantly unlocked. The very second his phone connected to the local cellular network, the device practically exploded in his hands. The phone began vibrating with such violent intensity that he almost dropped it onto the marble floor. The bright screen lit up with an endless, cascading waterfall of desperate notifications. There were over 300 missed calls. There were hundreds of frantic text messages from his board of directors, his lead investors, and his chief legal counsel. He opened the first text message he saw. It was from the chairman of the board, and it contained absolutely no polite corporate jargon. It simply read that the core intellectual property was completely gone. The company was legally halted, and Julian was going to face immediate federal prison time for gross corporate fraud. The blood drained completely from Julian's perfectly tanned face. He stood entirely frozen in the middle of the luxurious tropical lobby, his mouth hanging slightly open as he listened to a furious voicemail from his lead attorney screaming about a triggered morality clause and a massive sale to Vanguard Core. The romantic anniversary getaway instantly mutated into a waking, suffocating nightmare. Humiliated and completely unable to pay for even a single night at the resort, Julian and Mia were unceremoniously escorted right back to the airport dock by the suddenly unsmiling resort security staff. Standing in the sweltering heat of the main airport terminal, Julian desperately tried to salvage his rapidly crumbling reality. He had to get back to Silicon Valley immediately. He pulled out his personal debit card, the absolute only card completely disconnected from his frozen corporate empire. Its balance was pitifully low, because he intentionally routed all his lavish personal expenses through the company ledgers. He approached the airline counter, his expensive designer shirt now completely soaked in cold, nervous sweat. He was forced to purchase the absolute cheapest, non-refundable economy class ticket on a miserable red-eye flight departing that exact same night. He barely had enough funds left to cover the excess baggage fees. Mia stood silently next to his towering mountain of designer luggage, watching this pathetic display unfold with wide eyes. The golden, invincible tech god she had adored just 12 hours ago was currently hyperventilating at a ticketing counter, practically begging an indifferent airline employee for a cramped middle seat near the rear lavatory. She saw the absolute, naked terror in his eyes. She heard him frantically whispering into his phone about federal fraud charges, empty servers, and total bankruptcy. Mia was incredibly young, but she was definitely not stupid. She quickly realized her billionaire ticket to high society had just transformed into a massive, radioactive legal liability. She turned to Julian, her sweet, melodic voice remarkably cold and entirely flat. She told him she was feeling slightly claustrophobic and needed to step outside to get a breath of fresh air and perhaps a cup of coffee. Julian, entirely consumed by his own catastrophic panic, merely nodded vaguely without ever looking up from his glowing screen. Mia turned on her heel, walked straight out the sliding glass doors of the airport, hailed a local taxi, and completely vanished into the warm island night, abandoning him utterly alone with his worthless luggage. Nearly 24 agonizing hours later, Julian finally dragged himself up the grand driveway of his sprawling California estate. He was severely sleep-deprived. His custom suit was hopelessly wrinkled and smelled faintly of stale airplane cabin air, and his massive ego had been completely pulverized. The massive house was entirely dark and terrifyingly silent. He pushed the heavy mahogany front door open and stumbled into the grand foyer. The bright morning sunlight illuminated the empty, echoing space. That was exactly when he saw it. Sitting perfectly in the exact center of the heavy oak dining table was a thick stack of legal documents. He walked over slowly, his hands trembling violently. He stared down at the crisp white paper. It was the finalized intellectual property transfer agreement, boldly displaying the Vanguard Corps corporate logo. And resting heavily right on top of the signature line was my platinum wedding ring. In that devastating, painfully silent moment, looking at the undeniable, physical proof of his own absolute destruction, the great Julian finally realized that his quiet, boring, heavily underestimated wife had just executed the most flawless and fatal strike of his entire life. Julian did not just roll over and accept his complete and utter ruin. A cornered animal will always bite, and Julian was nothing if not desperate. He somehow managed to scrape together whatever pitiful favors he had left in the valley, and hired an incredibly aggressive, notoriously vicious divorce attorney. Exactly 3 weeks after the collapse of his empire, I received a formal notice. He was countersuing me. His legal claim was entirely predictable and dripping with his usual entitlement. He aggressively argued that because I had continued to write and refine the core algorithm during the years we were legally married, the resulting intellectual property was fundamentally a marital asset. He formally demanded exactly 50% of the $75 million I had secured from Vanguard Corps, boldly accusing me of malicious asset dissipation and financial abandonment. The mandatory virtual mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in California, which meant it was late afternoon for me. I was sitting comfortably on a sun-drenched, white stone balcony overlooking the sparkling, azure waters of the Amalfi Coast. A gentle, warm breeze carrying the sweet scent of nearby lemon groves softly ruffled my hair. I opened my laptop, typed in the secure meeting credentials, and watched the grid of faces populate my screen. Julian appeared in the center frame. He was sitting in a dark, cramped, wood-paneled legal office somewhere in Los Angeles. He looked physically exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were profound, and his custom suit looked slightly too large for his rapidly thinning frame. Yet, despite his pathetic appearance, his eyes gleamed with a very familiar, highly toxic arrogance. When he saw me sitting in the bright Italian sunlight, he offered a deeply smug, victorious smirk. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He genuinely thought he had me completely backed into a corner and was about to seize half of my fortune. His bulldog attorney immediately launched into a lengthy, highly aggressive monologue. The man threw around complex California community property laws, loudly referencing legal precedents and confidently demanding an immediate settlement of $37,500,000 to avoid a protracted public court battle. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced, sparkling water. I did not say a single word. I simply shifted my gaze to the top right square of the screen, where Victor Vance was perfectly illuminated in his Chicago office. Victor smiled. It was the terrifying, blood-chilling smile of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. "Counselor," Victor interrupted, his deep voice slicing smoothly through the other lawyer's aggressive rant. "Your passionate argument regarding marital property is certainly well articulated. However, it is also completely irrelevant. I believe you and your client have severely overlooked one vital piece of documentation." Victor shared a scanned document directly onto the video conference screen. It was boldly titled, "Corporate Liability Waiver Addendum." "Julian," Victor said, his tone dripping with mock politeness, "do you happen to remember a rather chaotic afternoon during the second year of your startup's operation? You were absolutely terrified of an impending corporate tax audit. You were frantic about shielding your personal assets from the federal government. Peyton handed you a thick stack of protective legal papers to sign. You signed every single page in under 2 minutes without reading a single word, completely blinded by your own panic and your desperate need to avoid paying your fair share of taxes." Julian squinted at the screen, his smug smirk beginning to waver slightly as genuine confusion set in. "That document," Victor continued, his voice echoing with finality, "was not just a corporate tax shield. It was, in fact, a legally binding, heavily fortified, post-nuptial agreement. By willingly signing your name on that dotted line, Julian, you explicitly, permanently, and irrevocably surrendered any and all current or future claims to any intellectual property designed, coded, patented, or sold by your wife. You literally signed away all your rights to her algorithm to save a few $1,000s on your personal tax returns. The money Peyton received from Vanguard Core is entirely, legally hers. The silence on the video call was absolute and incredibly heavy. Julian's fierce bulldog attorney leaned forward until his nose was nearly touching his webcam, his eyes frantically scanning the airtight legal clauses Victor had highlighted on the screen. I watched the color drain entirely from the lawyer's aggressive face. He was a seasoned professional, and he knew a catastrophic, fatal loss when he saw one. The attorney abruptly closed his thick leather folder with a loud, resounding snap. He muted his microphone for a brief, tense moment, turned his head to speak sharply to Julian, and then unmuted his audio. "My apologies to the mediator," the attorney announced, his voice completely devoid of its previous bravado. "I am officially withdrawing as legal counsel for the plaintiff, effective immediately, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest." That was the polite, professional legal translation for realizing his client was completely bankrupt and had absolutely no money to pay his exorbitant hourly fees. The attorney abruptly disconnected from the call, his square vanishing from the screen entirely. Julian was left totally alone. He completely unhinged, the last fragile remnants of his magnificent ego shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. He lunged toward his webcam, his face contorted in raw, unfiltered rage and sheer, suffocating panic. He began screaming incoherent threats, wildly cursing my name, and in the exact same breath, begging for mercy. He yelled that I owed him, that he was the visionary, that he was the only reason I was anything at all. I looked at his frantic, pathetic face one last time. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no resentment. I felt perfectly, beautifully empty. I moved my cursor over the bright red button at the bottom of the screen. I clicked it. The application closed. The screen reverted to my peaceful desktop wallpaper. The grueling legal battle was officially over. The very last binding thread holding us together had been permanently and cleanly severed. Later that evening, long after the sun had set, my cellular phone buzzed gently on the small iron table on my balcony. It was a single, long voicemail from Julian. I stood at the edge of the stone railing, watching the silver moonlight dance across the dark, rolling waves of the Mediterranean Sea, and I pressed play. He was sobbing loudly. It was a wet, heavy, pathetic sound. He begged me to come back to him. He desperately confessed that he was entirely lost, that he was absolutely nothing without me, and that his entire grand identity was nothing but a complete fabrication built entirely on my silent genius. He pleaded for a second chance, promising he would change everything. I stood there and listened to the entire 3-minute message. I did not feel a single ounce of gloating, and I experienced no triumphant joy at his misery. I only felt a profound, heavy pity for a hollow man who had foolishly traded his entire soul for a fragile, temporary illusion. I firmly pressed the delete button. The pathetic message vanished into the digital void forever. I set the phone down on the table and stepped away from it. I stood up perfectly straight, closed my eyes, and took a long, deep breath of the salty, intoxicating sea air. The heavy weight that had rested on my shoulders for 7 long years was completely gone. I opened my eyes, turned around, and walked out of my beautiful villa. I stepped down onto the vibrant, softly lit cobblestone streets, leaving the dark, heavy shadow of a betrayed wife far behind me, and I walked freely and brightly into my brand new, magnificent life. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where you are listening from today. So please leave a comment below. If you found my story today engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our team with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the PayPal link located in the description or the comments section. Your incredible generosity allows our dedicated staff to provide for their families and empowers us to continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you, and take care.